Good morning, everyone. We will get going. I expect a few more people will log on when they get their morning coffee over here on the East Coast in the US. Good morning to those of you from US logging on. Good evening. I know a few of you are logging on from Japan and India, Pakistan, where, of course, it's late in your day. Thanks a lot for staying up to join us for this meeting. We're going to talk today about advancing fire safety in the built environment. We're going to share with you all a few tools that we as a team within the World Bank have been developing over the last years, some resources, and we're going to hear from some of our participants that are going to share a bit about their experience working on this topic operationally within the World Bank Group. My name is Niels Holt Nielsen. I'm the practice manager for the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. We are a unit within the World Bank at a global level that attempts to generate partnerships, knowledge, services related to natural hazards and hazard risk to development. Within this unit, we have a program that focuses on building regulations. It's under this program that we have been working and developing these tools. We very much attempt to offer services through World Bank teams around the world. We do produce global public goods in form of knowledge. So all the knowledge we do produce is available for anyone who has access to the internet. But we attempt to influence development financing, how it's done, and how it integrates risk management in the context of what is done. The issue of today, urban fire risk, is a global problem. About 180,000 people die each year in fires in cities. Many more gets burns that affects them for life. There's not all that much work done to our knowledge within the World Bank Group and within development generally on urban fire risk. We think maybe it's one of several areas that are not enough attention to. Of course, that's why we have produced the knowledge and try to produce the help to the teams. We would like to draw a bit more focus on both the topic, but also on how to approach it in the context of World Bank work. We will be presenting today a few tools, as I mentioned. The one is called the Urban Frame, Urban Fire Regulatory Assessment and Mitigation Evaluation Diagnostic. And then the recently published Building Code Checklist for Fire Safety. And we hope we can all learn about the topic and discuss how to promote a broader integration of fire risk management as part of the urban and DRM agendas for sure, but quite possibly beyond that within other lines of work of the World Bank. Today we will have Ana Campos, who sits here on my right, who will be moderating the conversation. She's the lead disaster risk management specialist. We have a panel where my colleague Keiko Sakoda, who's senior disaster risk management specialist, and Brian Meacham, who is logging on, I believe, from Japan. He's on the screen. He's also the author of the tool that we will introduce and talk about how to use the findings for policy dialogue to advance fire safety. And after their presentations, we'll invite a discussant from our India work, Anup Karant, who's a senior disaster risk management specialist, I believe based in Delhi. And we will hear from Danielle Antonellis, who's a fire safety engineer and founder and executive director of Kindling. And they will share their ongoing efforts on advancing fire safety and their experiences of using some of the material and the work that we've been developing. And I will have to excuse myself in about 25 minutes. Unfortunately, my boss called in sick, which means that I need to do her work in addition to my work today. So I have to walk out of this conversation about a few minutes before the top of the hour, unfortunately. But with that, over to Keiko.
Thank you so much. So I would like to, thank you so much for introduction, Niels. And Yeah, as Niels mentioned, building regulations for resilience is one of the technical like a line of work under the GFBR, and Anna and I jointly lead this global effort. And over the past years, we've been developing multiple resources, as Niels also mentioned. And before I hand over the major point of today's discussion to Brian, I just wanted to introduce how our work, how our program works with country teams and then also the government. And I'm aware today we also have people from outside of the World Bank. So I hope that this would also help us to also find some form of partnership and collaboration in the future. So our BRR activity aims to help governments and governments to improve their building regulatory framework and implementation capacity through building regulatory and institutional reforms and capacity building and building process reform, building control process reforms. And in 2016, when we started this initiative, we started from the safety, but over the past years, we started to also cover green and inclusive aspect because of the interest and also demand from the clients. And then as a technical team, we provide services in 4 areas. One is regulatory review and also advisory to provide technical advice. And second is building control process review and advisory. This includes also the strategizing for the digitalization platforms. And the third is capacity building. This is not only for the government, but also for the private sector through association of engineers and architects and as a kind of group of people who are contributing to construction sector. And then the last part is global knowledge and sharing the good practice from different part of the world. And today, I think we are talking about more on the 4th element, but also introducing some practical example from different countries. Before we go into more technical detail, I just also want, maybe some people already know why we are doing this, but I just wanted to remind that why we need to invest in building regulatory enhancement, because it is very cost effective, and it is demonstrated over the past years that investing in improvement of building regulation would create multiple benefits. And according to the US statistics, $1 investment in improving building code would create $13 resilience impact in the built environment. And this is demonstrated over the past, through the data over the past disaster events. As I mentioned, there are like a multiple benefit, and the what you see on the left side is the typical structure of the building regulatory frameworks. But we also know in some other, some part of the groups that there are different legal system works. So we're also, expanding the knowledge of different legal system and different code mechanism to help to create the benefit, to minimize the, misunderstanding or facilitate the better compliance of the building regulatory frameworks in country levels. And this is how we work with governments and country teams of the World Bank Group. We work with or as part of the World Bank's country team who actually lead the policy dialogue or investment discussion with the government. And what you see on the top is a kind of major process that the country task team lead. And the lower side, you see how we help or how we contribute through the process. For the initial, high-level scoping and dialogue phase, we do quick desktop research about existing regulatory systems. We pre-identify potential area for discussions, and we join the conversation and technically lead the policy dialogue. And if the government is interested in to move on to more kind of advanced discussion stage, then we also come in with the diagnostics. And this is something that we want to talk about today. And we, over the past years, we developed a series of tools that facilitate this diagnostic process. And at the end of the diagnostics, we come up with a set of recommendations, which we use for the next step of the 3rd step to prioritize investment activities and area of policy reforms. Of course, the government is the one who prioritizes these activities, but we facilitate. So we provide workshops and then facilitate a conversation amongst the key stakeholders. And then if the proposed activities are integrated into the project, then we also support the supervision support during the implementation phase of the lending operation. And we have multiple resources in BRR team, but I just wanted to introduce two set of the major tools that we are talking about today. So one is on the left side, what you see is building regulatory capacity assessment. We published in 2017, and this is covering our entire building regulatory framework. So we look into the framework, existing framework according to this methodology, and try to also understand the intersection between building regulatory framework and other regulations, for example, fire regulation or disaster risk management regulation, or hazard information. But over the past years, we conducted 15 BRCAs in countries and then also state level. And then some feedback we received was the government needs more in-depth support to upgrade the building code, because some of the cases, as part of the BRCA recommendation, is to update the building code or create a new building code. However, the country also faced the difficulty of capacity gap to develop comprehensive building code on it by themselves. So then we started to have an idea, okay, how we can help this government to systematically and also learning from the global example. Then we developed this new set of tools on the right side. It's called Building Code Checklist. For learning from the global, building code, we are conducting comparative analysis of building codes, and we create 4 modules. One is structural resilience. Second is fire safety. Third is green buildings, and fourth is universal accessibility. And last fiscal year, we published fire and green buildings. And today we are talking about this fire safety tools. But next week on Wednesday, at the same time, we're introducing the green building one. So if you're interested in, please also join us for the next session too. So I'll not go into detail of the tools, right, because Brian is going to cover. But I just also wanted to share where we are working now. We are working across all 6 regions covered by the World Bank, and we are growing. I mean, some area we are starting from the very high level policy dialogue. In some country, we're doing the diagnostics. In some country, we're at the stage of project preparation, contributing to the project preparation. In some country, we're supporting the project implementation process. And in some country, we already finished engagement. So this includes all the project in different kind of stages. But overall, we are in kind of growing trend to cover more ground. So we are very happy to work with any teams who are joining today. So thank you so much. And before I hand over to Brian, I'll ask Anna to.
No, thank you, Keiko, very much. And I think this is a very good overall picture of the work that the Building Regulations for Resilience program is doing. So we will now make a deep dive on the specific tools for fire safety. I would like to hand over to Brian Marchand. He has been a consultant with the World Bank since 2016, but he's a person that has more than 40 years of experience related with building safety and especially with fire safety. He has a very impressive CV, so I cannot read all the achievements of what he has done because we need to keep some time for the discussion of the tools. But he has held a lot of leadership roles from NGOs, private sector, the academic sector, and even as an associate professor of different universities, and also as a president of the chair of the International Association for Fire Safety. So in that sense, I think is one of the persons more recognized in the field. So without more, I will hand it over to Brian to share his experience and the specific tools. Thank you very much, Brian, for being here. I know you're connecting from Japan at 10 p.m., so we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that introduction, and I'm glad to be here to speak to the building code checklist for fire safety and to speak a little bit about some of the other diagnostics as well in the overall scheme of how we're trying to help out in the fire safety area. So to set a little context, what I want to do is maybe speak a little bit about the global fire problem to focus in on why we're doing this type of work, spend a little time talking about the fire regulatory system and really the challenges of how we try to work with fire safety across multiple regulatory environments, because we have the building code, but fire is unique because we also typically have fire service acts and regulations and other regulations that we have to interact with. And so explaining the different systems that we work in and the different regulatory structures will set up how the building code checklist works through the different steps of the process to identify the different components, different regulations, different standards, and so forth that have to be considered in putting together a comprehensive package. And so when we think about the global annual fire problem, we have a range of impacts across people, property, and the environment. And when we think about the impacts to people, we're talking about, likely more than 150,000 deaths per year, tens of thousands of people displaced, and more than 7 million injuries related to burns and fires every year. And as I think most people here would expect, if you look at where the fatality data are around the world, it's disproportionate in the low and middle income countries. And so high income countries have put measures into place to keep urban and rural fire risk down, but it's real challenge in many other countries for a variety of reasons. And that's unfortunate in many respects, but if we look into some of those countries, and here I show some data from South Africa, you see that the trend is actually up in terms of the number of fire deaths per year that are reported. And the challenge is, of course, that not all deaths in all fires are reported. So we have a lack of data, but from the data we have, it's already trending up. And we're seeing a wide range of different types of problems. You might have seen this fire in the news not too long ago about an abandoned building that was taken over, had no fire protection in it. People were using it as shelter and ended up with a number of fatalities. And so when we think about the fire problem, it's not just new construction, it's the existing construction that becomes abandoned. It's also the challenge of informal construction and informal settlements, and how we get our handle around all of those different types of areas in the problem is really interesting and challenging. Maybe also important to a lot of countries is that there's, billions of dollars in losses and costs associated with fire. So if we look at the number of buildings that are lost or damaged and the billions of dollars that are a combination invested in fire protection or associated with direct fire losses, it can exceed 1% of GDP, and in some cases 3% or higher. We also see the loss of heritage buildings and from a variety of areas, not just the high income countries, but low and middle income countries as well. Increasingly, climate change is driving wildland fire, the intensity and the magnitude. You know, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of square kilometers burn. We could be killing over 100,000 people per year just from the smoke from wildland fire. And just in the US alone, the US National Institute of Standards and Technology has estimated it could be more than $340 billion of impact. And those of you might have seen, you know, what happens with wildfires, with the recent loss of the town of Lahaina in Maui, that very quickly fire starts to impact in the urban environment and you can lose whole communities. And so there's a number of drivers of change that we're seeing that is causing or, you know, facilitating some of the problems. Some of it is growing populations and rapid urbanization that puts more people at risk in times of construction and fast growth. And just a quick visual representation is looking at how Shanghai changed from 1990 to 2010 in terms of, you know, just how quickly a landscape can change. And we see this happening on a number of continents very quickly. And as I mentioned, the climate change resulting in drier conditions, higher temperatures, and increased wind speeds and more are creating more significant wildland fire risks, and the wildland urban interface fire risk becomes a significant issue as well. And I think we all can understand there are significant benefits to investing in increased fire safety from the human, social, economic, and environmental side by reducing losses, trauma, injury, and all the rest. And so broadly, there's a wide range of fire risk management needs that we need to think about. Some are in the building regulatory system arena, but some are beyond that. So if we think in a way of starting with a building, we can think about the building materials and how that might be regulated by a building regulation. And the building as an entity is one issue that we look at. But typically we're talking about, you know, multiple buildings that come together to form a community or a city. And in some cases, you'll have a mix of formal construction and informal construction in that environment. You also have to think about the infrastructure needs, and sometimes, you know, this might include water infrastructure for firefighting or not. You also have electrical infrastructure, which would be at different states of robustness. So poor electrical infrastructure becomes ignition hazard. If you don't have water infrastructure for firefighting, now you're a situation where the fire risk is higher. And now when we add to that the growing impact of wildland fire and the wildland urban interface, we see a range of different problems where you may have buildings in areas with good infrastructure and good protection, but you may have areas with no fire protection mechanisms in place, poor construction, and so forth. So if we look at the different kind of areas where we can have an impact on fire risk management, it can be in buildings through materials, systems, training of occupants, safety of occupants, and so forth. We can understand and work with how we can control fire risk or help people who are in informal settlements increase their capacity. Within the urban planning arena, we have to think about planning, zoning, building separation to mitigate conflagration potential, provide access for people. infrastructure for the fire service, water supply, and so forth, environmental planning to deal with wildland encroachment into the urban environment, and a whole range of support needs from test and certification facilities, professional training, skilled worker training, educational offerings, and more. And so this is really kind of the big picture of things that, we need to look at from fire risk management. And today we're focusing mostly on the fire safety checklist, and that really, of this whole list of areas that need attention from a risk management perspective, it's only two components around the buildings and the urban environment to the extent of the planning and zoning. So the other diagnostic that has been mentioned earlier, the urban frame, tries to get a little bit more at the breadth of the problem, but the building code checklist is really focused on the buildings and to the building regulations and the planning regulations to the extent that that's addressed within the particular regulatory system. So with that context in mind, if we start then to look at some of the building fire safety challenges, we have potential sources of ignition, which we often see as electrical sources. And if you're in an area that doesn't have a robust electrical infrastructure system and a highly taxed electrical system, that can form parts of ignition hazards in buildings. We're very concerned about the structural resilience of a building to fire, to prevent fire spread within the building on a certain floor or between floors, and the potential for the collapse of a building. We're very interested in the ability of people to safely egress a building in the event of a fire. Building fire safety also involves the suppression side, which could be active systems in the building or the manual response by the fire service. And fire service access has different issues in terms of, while we're trying to get people out of the building, the fire department and fire services going in, there may be access for apparatus around buildings, and it's an even bigger challenge when it's in an area of an informal settlement. If we're in a building, we might have different fire protection features that need to be maintained and operational, and you need to have the infrastructure to support those systems along the way. So if we think of all of those systems and all of those features into the building, we have to think a little bit now about where that fits within the building codes and the building regulatory system. So Keiko and Anna had mentioned the building regulation for resilience, which laid out the framework talking about the aspects of the national level legislation and institutions, the building code development and maintenance, and the local implementation, along with the support infrastructure that goes with it. And with the building code, using that same diagram that Keiko showed, where you're driving down from a building act into the building code and supporting documents, this is all here is really only focusing on a small part of the whole legislative and regulatory infrastructure, and not really getting even to any of the support areas. And even further, what we're doing with the building code checklist is really focused primarily on the building code and some of the support documents that can be in the form of alternative solutions, deemed to comply documents, or other types of verification methods. But as you can see, or maybe imagine here, because we have different types of components within the building code, it can be really challenging to find sometimes where all the fire safety provisions would be within the building code. And that is something that also leads to why we were looking at what kind of diagnostic would be helpful in really trying to understand where to go to look in the building code for fire safety provisions to determine maybe the adequacy of them. Are they right in the context and so forth? And so maybe to kind of illustrate that a little bit more, what we did was we looked at these different components that are major factors in the building fire safety risk management strategy and loaded them up into 6 particular areas that are typically used within building regulations as part of fire safety management. And that's really working on preventing ignition, resisting the spread of fire in the building and outside of the building, providing safety in areas of refuge and egress of occupants, having mechanisms for fire suppression, facilitating fire service access and facilities, and making sure that any systems that are in the buildings are maintained in good operating order. And so the building code checklist for fire safety is designed around these 6 fundamental areas. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the areas. It goes into quite a bit of detail in the diagnostic, and there's also a bit of an annex that talks about some of the fire fundamentals. But if we kind of just look at the major headings here, just walking through under fire prevention, it's broken then down into talking about things such as controls on electrical systems and appliances, controls on different types of gases and liquid fuels, hazardous materials, smoking and operation with hot surfaces, and controls during construction. And these are types of things that you might see built into a building code that are focused on preventing a fire from occurring. We know we can't prevent all fires from occurring, so then we need to look to control the fire or suppress the fire. So the next part is really the control of the fire through the construction, which we talk about as resistance to fire or resistance to the spread of fire. And here we're looking at the structural system and how it performs to fire, the fire resistance of interior barriers, which would be ceilings, walls, floors, and shafts, how we resist the spread of flame on interior surface materials as well as exterior surface materials. And both of those are challenges in many locations, especially because once you get the fire out of a window, if you have a combustible exterior, then you can rapidly spread the fire across the surface of the building. And then protection of any openings and looking at how we separate buildings so that we don't have a fire exposure from one igniting another or having an exterior hazard like a trash fire get into the building and cause damage as well. So those are all, major components of the resistance to fire spread. If we look then at occupant safety, refuge and egress, here we're looking at what systems are in place to warn people about fire, provide them with a protected escape route, and how to make sure that they have appropriate time to get out of the building. So typically that would involve things such as fire detection, notification of the occupants, providing protected means of escape that take into account the occupant load, travel distance, and capacity of the exits, as well as the characteristics of the occupants, particularly vulnerable populations, and then the protection of the people while they're moving in terms of safety barriers, glazing, and so forth. Fire suppression, we often look at in a few different areas, manual handheld fire extinguishers, water supply for manual suppression with water, or for automatic suppression systems that might be in buildings. When we're thinking about the fire service access and facilities, it's really important to think in terms of planning that the fire department can actually get near the building with their apparatus, have enough space to lift ladders and snorkels and so forth. There has to be, if there's a hydrant system, access to the hydrants outside and inside, typically accessible through the stairwells. In tall buildings, we're dealing with firefighter lifts and communication systems. And then importantly, we need to have robust inspection test and maintenance plans, as well as training, because as you get more complex in the fire protection systems you're putting in the building, if you don't maintain them, it's really a false sense of security, because you won't have the protection, either passive systems or active, when you need them. And if you don't train the people and fire wardens and occupants in the building, people won't know how to escape safely, and you have to understand how that fits with the safety management plans and the whole permitting and approvals processes. And so those are all different aspects that are looked at in the building code checklist for fire safety. When we talk about how the regulatory system works, however, it gets to be really complicated sometimes when we try to figure out where do you find in the building code all of these different components. So if we kind of look at a building and say we're going to do a building design or a building regulation, typically you're going to have to look at the Planning Act to deal with what the planning and zoning is, as well as the Building Act to see how the building is regulated. And that you would do for structural design, for example, as well as for fire. But for fire, we have additionally, typically, the need for Fire Service Act or legislation that would have a role, at least in the manual suppression. So the Planning Act deals with roadway access. It might deal with water supply infrastructure. It would impact, for example, fire service access to a building or site. The Building Act is focused on the building regulation, and in some countries would only address egress and structural fire protection. In some countries, the fire service legislation not only has the fire service, but automatic and manual systems for fire protection. So you have this complication that smoke detection and smoke control may be in the Building Act, or it may be in the Fire Services Act. You may have manual and automatic suppression in the fire service or under the building regulations. So you have to really look around at what the different legislation is, see where the provisions are for fire safety features, and make sure you cover them. We have then the added complication of, if you're looking at electrical infrastructure to control for fire prevention, you have to look at energy acts. If you're looking at wildland urban interface, you're into environmental acts, and some countries will have different regulations on industrial uses. So there may be a lot of documents that you have to look at to get the full picture of what's happening with fire safety. So structural may have, for example, a limited set of regulations, whereas for fire, there's quite a bit that you would have to look at. We can also look at that a little bit differently when we think about how the code is structured. Most building codes will talk about goals and expectations for the building and have means to demonstrate compliance. And so if we think about a few of them for fire, safety to life, maintaining structural stability in a fire, which would be then saying we want to have the ability to withstand the fire load with no collapse. And so that's all pretty straightforward. until you get to this point of where you want to demonstrate compliance. Here, that might be in the regulation. It might be in a separate deemed to satisfy document or approved document, or it might be done through an engineered design. And if you're going to go through engineered design, there may be compliance documents that are in reference standards such as the Euro codes or others, and you have a whole set of consensus standards for test, inspection, and maintenance that go along with that. And so if you're looking for the societal aspiration or goal, that's easy to find in the act or regulation. Functional requirements are typically in the regulation or the deemed to satisfy, but you might have to look through regulations deemed to satisfy and through consensus documents and standards to find where all the different provisions are to give you the full set of fire safety issues. So it can get to be quite complex. So the checklist tries to walk you through all of those different issues, identify where the problems are so that you understand the regulatory framework, know kind of where you might have to look for fire-related regulations and the chapters in those regulations. It gives a framework for a systematic review. It points out the need to really think about the country context, to assess the interface with other regulations, and then go ahead and write it up and report it. So understanding the regulatory framework, we talk about the different types of regulatory systems, where you might be able to find the specific provisions within that type of regulatory system, and a little bit about examples of where the standards might be. So for example, England's a function-based system, so there's no detailed provisions for fire safety in the regulations. You have to go to the approved documents, which would be approved document B. But even there, it cites standards of the British Standards Institution or SEN standards. And so you usually have to look across a range of documents to find all of the issues. We then lay out the checklist by these 6 different areas that I had overviewed before. And in each of the areas, and I'll use resistance to fire as an example, there's a table that will help do kind of a systematic check. So it's laid out as topic, basically why it's important, what are some of the questions that you would want to look at to determine the relevance, and then where you might look within the different building regulation itself. So this will be too much to read. I'm not expecting you to read it, but as an example, if you're looking at resistance to fire, it's really trying to make sure that the structural system will withstand the effects of a fire and not collapse on people. So the relevance is really that you want to make sure that for the type of fire you're expecting and the size of the building, the structural frame is appropriate to the design. And the diagnostic questions are whether the building regulations have that type of structural stability under load. Are there limits for fire resistance rating? Are there tables that can be used by designers and so forth? And then where to look gives a range of opportunities to say it might be in the building code, it might be in a reference document such as the Euro code for structures, it may be in a reference standard or so forth. And so that gives you kind of the step-by-step process. And you also have to then think a little bit about the context, whether you're doing an urban environment and in what kind of state that environment is in, whether it's informal construction or others. The interface with other regulations, I'll just quickly kind of go through here. I did a project for PRIF in the Pacific Islands, and just as an example, in Nauru, we had to look at the Rescue and Fire Services Act, the electrical installation guidelines, the Infrastructure Strategic Plan, the Environmental Management and Climate Act, and National Disaster Risk Management Act, all as part of kind of looking at the building code system to get a complete picture. Finally, you can pull all the things together into a report. And here I'll draw a little bit from work that Danielle and Anoop have done. So I hope I don't steal any of their thunder, but an example of how they did it was to kind of take the purpose statement of why we're looking at, in this case, structural stability in the case of fire. In India, where they were looking, they looked at the code to see where that was addressed in the code. And then they identified some of the issues that they found in the code versus some of the components that they saw when they looked at the field conditions. And I think we'll hear a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. And there's other ways you can look at this as well in terms of how different interactions of the regulations come in. And if you're doing a high level review, we did this for the Seychelles a year or two ago. It gives you a mechanism to look between regulations, look for gaps, see what's being referenced, and determine whether or not you're catching everything. So in the last couple of slides, I just wanted to point out that I spoke mostly about the building code checklist for fire safety, but the urban frame really looks at the broader fire risk management and legislative framework, and it can come into play in a wide range of areas, whether you're talking about disaster mitigation and vulnerability reduction or disaster recovery, climate change, and anytime we're looking at mitigation and adaptation, because we have to look at multi-hazard events as well, disability and inclusive environments, informal settlements, and cultural heritage. And the urban frame and the checklist come together to really help give a comprehensive view of what could be done. So when we look at translating opportunities to integrate fire safety into the different activities, it can be around any type of kind of assessment to disaster event or recovery from the disaster event, investments for land use planning, roadway access, transportation, resilience, infrastructure upgrades, location of water supply, and so forth. And so there's just many opportunities here where also capacity building for people, opportunities for test facilities. There's just a very long list of different types of projects the bank invests in that really have an opportunity for looking at the fire resilience as we're doing it. So I've gone a couple minutes over my time, but that summarizes where we are with the building fire safety checklist, and I hope that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what it is. Thank you.
We look
I think you're on
forward.
mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, thanks, Brian, for very interesting presentation. I hope all the people connected are getting excited. Please post your questions on the chat while we develop the other presentation so we can go quickly to the Q&A session after we finalize all the presentations. So I would like to introduce our colleague, Anoop Karant. He's a senior disaster risk management specialist. He has more than 14 years of experience, and he has been leading several projects and programs in South and Southeast Asia. So he will share with us his specific experience in this topic in South Asia. So over to you, Anoop.
Thanks, Anna. Is my slide deck, can you see it? Is it on the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Anna, and thanks to GFDRR, for giving us the opportunity, to share our insights into the work that we have been doing for the last few years with the support that has come from both within our internal programs as well as the support that has come extensively from GFDRR in furthering this agenda. I will briefly touch upon and give a kind of a background in terms of why we are emphasizing on this particular topic, and I'll further request Daniel, who has supported our unit over the last few months to do a first of its kind of an assessment, especially looking at hospital and education buildings. We initiated a kind of a work which is called as advancing fire safety in the built environment, and there was a particular reason why we went around doing this kind of a study. Before I get into the specific issues, which prompted us to get into understanding of fire safety in the built environment, just to give you a quick background in terms of the numbers, we have a very large number of fire accidents. These accidents are categorized and they're all documented well in the National Crime Record Bureau. But if you just look at the numbers, if you look at 2017, we had close to about 27,000 deaths that occurred because of fires. And when we look at global statistics, this is quite a staggering number in terms of the deaths that happen due to fire. And over the last few years, we have seen there is a kind of a drastic reduction. But as I said, these are statistical data. But when we start looking into a couple of other journals and a couple of other research articles, we also find that we have a huge number of people, who also suffer from burn injuries, and there are a lot of fatalities. This is not to say that, we don't understand in terms of what the numbers are, but I think for all policy and decision-making purposes, we typically use the records that come from the National Crime Record Bureau, which publishes the accidental deaths and suicides in India, and we have categorized information in terms of the fire deaths across the country. When I look at this particular data and when I map this around, to a large number of countries, and I think in the previous presentation, we also heard from Brian in terms of, the numbers across the globe. But what is very staggering in terms of, the numbers are that we did have, kind of peaks, which touched upon 25,000 wave in the mid 90s. We again had a similar kind of an episode way back in the mid 2008, 2010, where the numbers again peaked up. And now there is a kind of a gradual decline. But as I said, it's again very important to understand in terms of, where these numbers are coming from. Are we really doing enough in terms of addressing and getting these numbers appropriately? From the DRM project's perspective, we do a lot of mitigation projects here in India and also recovery projects. And we enter into the scene, working with the state government and the local government in terms of addressing a variety of requests, that come to us. We design programs which are particularly, spread over 5 to 8 years. And we have done a few projects where we have built up, certain elements of fire safety, but I think a lot more needs to be done. And this is the reason, why we are on this conversation today. Our projects essentially target investments which are on resilient housing, which is post-disaster recovery housing. We built up a large number of multi-purpose emergency shelters across the coastline, primarily to look at supporting evacuation. Now we're also doing this in a large number of flood-prone areas, flood-prone states. We invest a lot in terms of, recovery on education and health, which also means strengthening existing health and education buildings, but also building up new infrastructure on the health and the education facilities. Working with the fire department and fire and emergency services across several states and help in terms of, putting up the fire stations, and also looking at supporting the state disaster response force in terms of, putting the response centers. These are massive infrastructure investments which are put across through the projects. The reason why I'm emphasizing that, these are not just buildings, but these are also buildings which have to survive on its own, so that they can cater better and also be available to any kind of emergency that arises in their respective locations. In addition to that, we build up large number of emergency operation centers. We augment and we strengthen existing emergency operation centers. The one that you see there on the top is an emergency operation center, which is currently being built in Uttarakhand with the base isolation design, which you see to the next picture. The picture to the next top, it is the Disaster Response Force campus, which is a massive campus built in Uttarakhand for ensuring that the state disaster response units have all the facilities built for their internal capabilities to deal with emergencies. And some of the pictures what you see there at the bottom are the multi-purpose cyclone shelters and other investments that we have built across through our operations. What really matters, and I think this is something, you know, which we have been struggling very hard in our operations. You know, one is that there is a renewed focus that we strongly feel within our unit here to emphasize and bring in fire and life safety as a kind of a provision within the investments. And some of the reasons, you know, why we think, you know, it's very critical is because of our investments, especially in the emergency response centers and the relief camps upgradation that we do. We find that we build these structures, but, you know, the occupancy and the use, you know, they vary from time to time. And in fact, you know, during the COVID, a large number of these emergency operation centers, you know, were used for COVID centers. And the moment you use these COVID centers, you know, to be very honest, you know, we never anticipated at one point of time that these shelters are going to be used as you know, a middle tier, you know, emergency operation centers from a medical emergency standpoint of view. And given that there is so much of temporary investments that take place in these buildings, you suddenly have a kind of a use pattern change, and, you know, that it itself has a lot of risk in terms of, you know, how to address the issue of fire safety. We also have seen that a large number of buildings, there is a sudden change in the fire load. You know, most of the times, you know, when you have evacuations in existing relief shelters, you know, people come with a lot of wood, which is used as fuel for you know, for cooking. They also carry a large number of inflammable materials. They bring in a large number of LPG gas cylinders. What happens in these buildings is that, you know, these buildings, which are typically used as education buildings, you know, they have never been designed for carrying this kind of fire loads. So it becomes very important that when we go into these structures and we talk about strengthening it from a DRM perspective and from our investment perspective, we have to then take into account of a lot of, you know, new issues on fire safety, so that during the peak emergency period and when people move into these structures, you know, we need to ensure that fire safety provisions are also adequately addressed. What we've also seen is that the evacuation plan and the exit requirements, it suddenly changes with a large number of people actually moving in. Though we follow the National Building Code requirements, but at times, you know, you have a huge influx of people. We may design it for 500 people, but, you know, when you really look on the ground situation, you may have more than 1,000 people actually staying in these shelters. So this all changes, you know, in terms of, you know, how do we build up that perspective, educate our client, but educate ourselves, and also educate in terms of, you know, working with our design teams in terms of, you know, how do we build up this whole fire and life safety agenda within the requirements. We have also come across very typical issues. When we look at design, it has to be a comprehensive safety design. You know, from a structural design perspective, it's very important that we adhere to the requirements, but at the same time, the lightning and the surge protection and the electrical safety, these become very important. A lot of the electrical safety negligence is what is actually causing a huge amount of fires in the building. So this is again a kind of a point for all of us to look in terms of addressing it from a comprehensive safety design perspective and embed all the aspects of structural as well as the electrical and the fire safety design into it. As I mentioned that we do follow codal provisions, the National Building Code and all the other codal provisions. But I think, as I said, you know, our challenge is also to see whether we can enhance these requirements depending on the use, depending on the kind of criticality of the infrastructure. And there is definitely a need that we have found to go even beyond the codal requirements. And this emerges from our recent experiences of how these buildings have been typically used and the kind of fire incidences that have recently taken place, both in the hospitals as well as in large critical infrastructure buildings, especially the emergency operations center, the data centers, etc. The last point I want to touch upon here is also on the fire zoning. I mean, though the National Building Code does talk about fire zoning, but what we have typically found, and this again came from the study that was supported from GFDRR on the building regulatory capacity assessment that we did for the state of Uttarakhand. The real challenge is in terms of, you know, how the cities actually spread over a period of time, and, you know, how do we then start integrating the fire zoning, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. We'll not get into the details today, but it's very important to see that, you know, these zones, you know, they tend to overlap as the city grows. The last point I want to touch upon is on an incremental provisions that we may think upon when we look at retrofitting our investments. I think what we've done and what we've done also globally as a bank is that we have been involved very much in seismic retrofitting and energy retrofitting investments across the globe. And I think, you know, there is a lot that we need to still understand in terms of how do we bring in the fire and the life safety aspect into it. This is one of the points that we touched upon in our study, which Daniel will briefly explain. But I think few points which I just want to highlight here from a practical perspective in terms of the struggle that we go through is to build in the fire safety provisions, especially when it comes to critical buildings where we provide base isolation designs. I mean, from an earthquake safety perspective, yes, we have done a great job, but we also have to see that in terms of how we can bring in the fire protection systems into the same structure and ensure that the building performs well, both from a fire perspective as well as from the seismic perspective. A lot of retrofitting investments that are being pushed by the designers are subject to an interesting process that we have found recently, that the FRP systems, which are typically used for fire safety, are very combustible, and it's very important to see that we should not end up dealing with one hazard and neglecting the other part of it. And this again becomes a very critical part for us to look in terms of how do we look at the performance aspects of both the fire safety as well as the seismic safety. We came across this very interesting work from Daniel. She will explain this, but in her report, it has come out very clear that the high performance concrete as well as the normal performance concrete, they behave very differently when it comes to using a choice of material when we talk about having it in our structures. So this is an important point that we need to really validate in terms of talking to the design team, talking to our codal engineers, but also to people who implement these things in our own infrastructure as well as the other infrastructure that comes up. The last point I want to just highlight is that when we do retrofitting, one of the biggest challenges that we come across is we put in a lot of additional elements into the structure, but to be very honest, it changes the whole dynamics of the evacuation. And I think this is something that we need to be super careful, and we need to work very closely with the fire department, with the fire engineers, to make sure that we build in a kind of a compatibility to address both the hazards or multiple hazards, as we design the facilities. So I'll just pause here and over to you, Anna, and I think we can ask Daniel to come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think that was really very interesting, and to see the comprehensive approach that you are following in the portfolio in South Asia. I will hand it over now to Danielle Antonellis. She is a fire expert is an engineer with more than 11 years of experience. She's the founder and executive director of Kindling. It's an NGO specialized in the development of inclusive approaches to improve fire safety and fire resilience in low-income communities, humanitarian contexts, and low and middle-income countries. So over to you, Danielle, to share your experience. And also, they have used and implemented the tool that we just described before. So she will talk a little bit also about how was that experience using the tool. Over to you, Danielle. Thank you for joining.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna and Anoop. Yeah, it's great to be able to join this session and share some of our relevant experience. To kind of further just spend a minute introducing Kindling, as it's an organization most of you probably haven't had a chance to learn about before. I wanted to share that we are a US-based nonprofit organization really dedicated to making fire safety accessible for everyone globally. And there's a few kind of ways that we look at fire that I think are just useful context for this conversation. So urban fire risk often emerges as an unintended consequence of development. And it's often not well integrated into disaster risk management or urban development processes generally. And at Kindling, we're approaching fire safety as a socio-technical system. We're aiming to understand both the unsafe conditions themselves as well as the systemic issues that are underpinning them. And we really believe that when disciplines and field of expertise interact and collaborate, then we can have capacity to explore much different thinking. So we are a highly interdisciplinary team, including engineers, social scientists, geographers, disaster risk reduction specialists, and more. And we work across government, academia, private sector, third sector, humanitarian sector generally, and critically, of course, with the public. Our theory of change at Kindling is very focused on carrying out socio-technical assessments of fire risk in different settings, working on fire risk reduction planning, and generally around research, education, and advocacy. We specialize in urban fire, including fire risk in informal environments and humanitarian settlements globally. And as Anna said, we work quite a bit in low and middle income countries, though we also do work in high income countries, focusing on issues that affect marginalized communities that are highly vulnerable to fire. So today I'll be sharing some of the kind of an overview and some of the key learning from this project around advancing fire safety in the built environment, focused on the state of Uttarakhand in India. And as it kind of says in the name, the purpose of this project was to enhance fire safety and resilience of existing and new planned infrastructure, building infrastructure. And it's all about better positioning the World Bank to support the government in designing relevant investments, activities, both kind of high level and downstream activities, and also promoting incremental fire and life safety upgrades into disaster risk management investments. Before jumping into the details, I just want to quickly acknowledge the team behind this work. So I'm from the US, Antonio Ciccione is from South Africa, Abhay is from India, Venkatesh and Venki are also from India, although Venkatesh, Dr. Kador, is based in the US. And we also have peer reviewers, which are listed on the screen, and Brian was also one of the peer reviewers. So thank you, Brian, for your support on that. And we're all fire safety engineers, academics, and professionals, so specialists in fire safety. So it's important to kind of really focus on hospitals for this discussion. As Anoop mentioned, in this project, we did actually look at healthcare facilities as well as educational facilities. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to focus on healthcare facilities since we only have a few minutes together. And if we think about hospital fires, especially in an Indian context where there have been a lot of incidents in the recent past, it's very clear that fire can be devastating in hospital settings, with extremely high levels of loss of life, injuries, loss of property, and more. Of course, hospitals are critical infrastructure, and they're relied upon during and after disasters in particular. And there is a high potential for loss because we have such large numbers of vulnerable people that are often incapable of self-preservation. And people are often reliant on equipment or procedures and can't be moved easily. So if we zoom into thinking about fire safety in Uttarakhand, we're going to first think about this through the lens of the NFPA, or National Fire Protection Association's fire and life safety ecosystem. Which really helps us think about fire safety as this interconnected system of systems. It's looking at different elements such as communities, infrastructure, personnel, equipment, regulatory environments, etc., interacting very dynamically, and thinking about this in this way kind of helps us break down and understand fire safety more holistically at the state level in this particular situation. In Uttarakhand, there is a bureaucratic framework for fire safety, but there's often a lack of skilled workforce and adequate investments in safety affecting compliance and maintenance standards. Moreover, emergency preparedness is frequently reactive with less emphasis on community engagement and public awareness. And this is a significant concern in a state that is prone to both building fires as well as forest fires and other natural hazards, where many of the capacities that are built for fire safety also support other types of hazard responses. So while the fire safety component in Uttarakhand has multiple components, it suffers from gaps and disjointed implementation that could compromise safety and necessitate a more cohesive region-specific strategy. Now, our approach used both of the key documents and tools that were shared by Brian. We looked at applying, and when we did apply the Urban Frame tool. So this is the Urban Fire Regulatory Assessment and Mitigation Evaluation Diagnostic. We looked at the kind of building fire safety regulatory system generally. And then we used the building code checklist for fire safety to actually review the National Building Code of India for requirements related to healthcare infrastructure as well as educational. But again, I'm just going to focus on the hospitals now. And that checklist was not only helpful for the kind of evaluation of the Building Code of India, but then when we actually went on site and carried out inspections, assessing the implementation of these requirements. The checklist was very helpful for us throughout that process. And as Brian showed in one of his slides, we actually organized our deliverables using some of the language from his checklist as well as his overall organization of the information. So I'm going to focus less in my few slides here on kind of how we showed the information, and instead kind of talk more about the process of the project overall and how the checklist supported that project. So I don't expect you to follow these loops right now. I'm not going to kind of explain all of this, but I just wanted to share a visual that is one of the visuals we use in our report to show how the process works when you are actually going through, if someone is trying to submit plans and get approval for a building construction project in Uttarakhand. But kind of this slide is more thinking about how can I share a little bit about the building regulatory system in Uttarakhand more generally. And in India as well, because in India, there is no uniform national system governing fire safety. The legislative framework operates within a federal structure comprising of union or central government and individual state governments, but they might even delegate that further to local bodies. So in Uttarakhand, enforcement of fire safety measures is a key function of the Uttarakhand Fire and Emergency Services, UFES we call it, while development and updating of the building codes are typically governed by bodies of the Uttarakhand Housing and Urban Development Authority in line with national guidelines such as the National Building Code. And while that is adopted for new construction, it's actually not very clear what guidance should be used for existing buildings. The legislation has a lot of ambiguity around how existing buildings should be treated. And furthermore, there's gaps as far as kind of indigenous, non-engineered, or informal buildings as well. Regulations and policies outline fire safety requirements and responsibilities, but there are significant gaps in relation to enforcement capabilities and capacities of responsible parties, especially with the fire and emergency services. And there's a real opportunity now to think about how can we support building capacity of the fire services and other key actors. So thinking about not just the legislative aspects, the policy frameworks of the regulatory framework, but the more implementation side of it as well, and how we can support that is an exciting opportunity that we learned from this project. Design and construction professionals are also in critical need of more education and support, including architects and engineers, but also installers of fire safety systems, maintainers, etc. So this is, of course, all information that we learned by applying the urban frame methodology. And there's a lot more, and we'll be publishing the report soon, so you'll be able to read more about that. And then we moved into the next step, which was reviewing requirements in the National Building Code for hospitals and schools. And I really just want to spend this slide emphasizing the value of this checklist. This is the first comprehensive and systematic tool I've seen as a fire safety engineer, to be able to actually look at a building code and think about it in a very clear and sequential way. And it helped us look at buildings specifically that we inspected as well through this kind of clear sequential roadmap, and figuring out how we made sure that we covered all the different elements, but also tied them together in a very logical way. And I can't kind of emphasize the value educationally of this document as well. We often find that it is very difficult for people from a non-technical background to understand some of the more technical issues that are identified in fire inspections. But actually, this document breaks it all down based on principles. And that was really useful in us being able to communicate to non-technical audiences and relate very specific findings to why they really matter. Again, there hasn't been guidance available to support assessments of building codes for fire safety in the past, and individuals really rely on their own familiarity and specific code experience rather than clearly articulated overarching principles, which is important when we're all coming from different countries and looking at things from different lenses. So we found that the checklist really united us and enabled us to bring our experiences together to still benefit from that international team's perspectives, but doing it in a very united way where we could all get behind the same principles. This slide just includes some pictures of findings from the actual factory buildings, just so I can share some of the kind of key findings that are very tangible, because I think what's nice about fire safety investments is that it actually can go all the way from these large kind of national and state level legislative systems and kind of policy analysis all the way down to a single sprinkler. So there really is this kind of very wide range of issues that we think about. And I just wanted to highlight some of those. So we did see locked kind of exits, which are extremely dangerous in a hospital setting, or mostly any setting really, for fire safety. We saw kind of sprinklers that didn't have their caps on. We saw fire alarm systems that didn't have appropriate wiring and could easily be disconnected and were not actually functioned. But I think the overall findings here that's kind of relevant to explain is that there's an emphasis on the presence of fire safety systems rather than on their performance or function. So we found that we had non-functional fire detection alarm systems, non-functional sprinkler systems. We had exit stairs that were gated but also not protected from fire and smoke traveling between the floors. We had kind of these different elements that were provided as far as number of exits, for example, but actually they weren't functioning well. And so what we found is that the investments that were made in fire safety by these hospitals weren't actually being kind of benefiting the occupants and the hospital itself. So there's a real opportunity here to think about how the World Bank can actually support kind of capitalizing on investments that were already made by kind of these specific focus on fire safety. I'm gonna just skip over this slide because I think Anoop did a really great job and I'm conscious of time, but I think there's an opportunity and a risk related to seismic retrofitting, which I'm happy to speak more about in the discussion. And I also think it's important to identify and kind of share some of the opportunities for investment that came out of this project. So certainly there's a need for kind of fire risk assessments and preparation of blueprints or plans for fire risk reductions. We were focused on the state scale for Uttarakhand, but certainly you can think about this for settlements, cities, national scale, and you can look at it through specific lenses such as healthcare, or look at it more generally. Of course, there's a need for urban fire regulatory mitigation assessments in many different places. Certainly, there's an opportunity to look at the country of India and try to understand how our findings relate more generally. There's opportunities for regulatory system infrastructure upgrades. So thinking about regulatory processes, the development of online tools and systems can be useful. And I know Anoop had some examples to share from other states in India. As I mentioned, capabilities and capacities around enforcement of building codes and kind of supporting compliance is limited. And so there are really tangible opportunities to support local authorities having jurisdictions, including fire departments, on how they can actually better kind of have inspections. And we have some plans and hopes to do a project around joint inspection and reporting, as well as development of tools and programs so that they can learn through collaboration. Certainly there are opportunities for direct kind of audit programs and retrofitting of healthcare and education infrastructure and other buildings, or even thinking about it beyond the building scale at settlement or city scale. Development of fire safety toolkits for facility management and staff, so really looking at it from an education lens. Data capture and analytics, and as Anoop already spoke about, trying to integrate fire safety into terms of reference for other projects to avoid unintended consequences and leverage opportunities that are aligned to the project's objectives and activities. If you'll just bear with me for one more slide, I just want to share a little bit about an example that's outside of India that I think is also a relevant use of this work. So I'm currently in Karachi, Pakistan. And I'm here with the International Accords through their Pakistan Accord program. And we are inspecting factory buildings around Karachi and Lahore over these few weeks, and actually launching and building up a new program to inspect factories here and support factory remediation programs around structural safety, fire safety, electrical safety, boiler safety, and hazardous materials. This program is the second country that the International Accord has worked in. So some of you might be familiar with the Bangladesh Accord that operated for about a decade in Bangladesh after the Rana Plaza collapse in 2013. There is now a local organization called the RSC that is continuing that work. But the reason I bring up the Accord is because we used this checklist actually in order to develop our approach in Pakistan. So this is a diagram from the checklist document, and you can see the kind of 6 key components of building fire safety and the kind of sub controls or systems that support those objectives. And we were actually able to identify what are critical life safety systems in factory buildings using this. And because the Accord is not focused on compliance from a building code perspective, but actually on life safety from the perspective of occupants and trying to assure that the private sector investors through brands that are sourcing from Pakistan have a reasonable level of life safety. And so there are certain aspects of fire safety that we prioritize over others. Again, happy to chat more about that in the discussion, but I think in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation and hopefully connecting with some of you offline. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Really very interesting to see the implementation and also the recommendations that you have identified that answer probably some of the questions that we are receiving in the chat. But some of the questions that we have received is about, we have seen the huge gaps that some countries have in South Asia and Africa regions, in other regions. So how to prioritize the policy dialogue, how to strengthen the capacity, very quickly on the control side, know what are the main elements that we can focus on. So I know it is a full mouth of here, but if you can say, Brian, probably in 2-3 words, what will be the criteria for prioritization in these environments where we still have and oversee a lot of gaps?
Yeah, so it's going to be tough in a few words, but I think, you know, one thing for me, and I think Anoop and Danielle talked about it, is, you know, when you're talking to a government or a client about issues that they're already working on, particularly around infrastructure and resilience, climate mitigation, and so forth, adding fire to that policy discussion is relatively easy. Plus, you can make the argument almost any hazard that you're looking to mitigate has a fire relationship. And Anoop talked about post-earthquake fire issue, but also, you know, earthquake resilience components that could cause a fire hazard. If you're thinking about flooding, you know, even us in the US, we, in Superstorm Sandy, flooding in a neighborhood meant that the fire service couldn't get in, so 100 buildings burnt down when the fire occurred. So you have to plan for those multiple events. And water runoff design in the state of Colorado facilitated a wildland fire that burned down an area in the Marshall Fire. So hazards are interrelated and people don't think about the fire aspects, but if it's any policy related to an infrastructure upgrade, a roadway systems, transportation systems, urban, and so forth, it's very easy, I think, to tie in the fire safety aspects there. I think the capacity building one is a huge one that's really under focused, and Anoop talked about that. Danielle had it in her slides as well. But the biggest problem, I won't say the biggest, I shouldn't say the biggest. One of the biggest problems we have is you can build a really good building on day one, but in year 5, year 10, year 20, if that building's not maintained, that's when you see the real performance issues. You see the use of the building actually creating hazards. The fuel load is changing, the occupant load is changing. So building the capacity of the the regulators, the enforcers, even of the building owners in the community to know how to deal with those issues is really important. So all of those things can come in, I think, as really related to policy initiatives that are not, fire, but are supporting fire safety as part of bigger initiatives that are underway.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I would like to filter some of the questions because of the time. We will put you, any of the participants, in contact with some of the speakers. So in case you want to follow up, so we don't cut kind of the conversation short, because part of the process that we wanted this is just to get you familiar with this, get excited about implementing it. So we will facilitate that conversation. But Daniel, one of the questions that we receive is about the timing. How long does it take to implement this assessment using, for example, the tool? I know you were very specific on some typologies of buildings, but if you can talk about your experience specifically.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. So I didn't get into the specifics of our methodology too much, but we did end up traveling to Uttarakhand on 2 different occasions. I think that probably can be shortened to one trip that's a bit more efficient in the future. So I would say, and Anoop, please jump in after this, but I would say this whole process could be done in 2 months, probably at this stage. It took longer as we were piloting and learning, and it was a much more iterative process, I would say, for this first time around, because we weren't only applying one methodology, we were also, bringing together the urban frame as well as the building code checklist, but we were also applying kind of risk-based and operational performance approaches of inspection and trying to connect that back. So at this stage, I would say that we could deliver that whole methodology probably in, even 1 to 2 months, depending on how much capacity the team had to travel and make it happen quickly. Anoop, please jump in if you have any other comments.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to
Thanks,
add
Daniel.
that, I just want to add a point here that I think the whole discussion in terms of getting the government buy-in and the administration buy-in essentially came from the BRCS study that we did earlier. I think it helped us to really navigate to understand, fire as a potential issue, and that is how we were able to, take like 2 different steps. You did an assessment of the entire state. We identified there's a potential problem around fire safety. And then at the same time, we're also doing these investments. That is how we were able to get a kind of a buy-in. I think what's very important is not just about the timeline of the assessment, but for the system to be there, up and ready for taking up this kind of studies for their own benefit. Anna, you're not audible. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Now, can you hear me now? We have a very
Yes.
interesting exchange in the chat, so we invite people to look at the chat, because there are some exchanges or also complementary resources that have been developed by the IFC, for example, for fire safety in hospitals, etc. That could be interesting to some of the participants here. One important aspect also that we got in the questions is related to data. We have talked about the gaps in data and how we cannot really speak of the numbers on the impacts that the fire safety is having. And if that is not visible, it's sometimes very difficult to make the case for a government to make the investments that are required in improving this provision. So what will be the recommendations to improve that data and how that can be done?
2 quick
Yes.
things. Okay, just come
Go
in,
ahead, Anoop.
Brian. I think 2 quick things, which we can really work upon. One is, I think, in general, what we have seen so far is that even the home buyers aren't aware of, how safe the buildings are. I mean, obviously structural, but fire is another big issue that the homeowners are typically not aware of. And so is the potential issue with the infrastructure owners. When we interacted with the hospital community in Uttarakhand, when we go and meet the chief medical officer, the chief medical officer is focused primarily on the operations of the hospital and not so much on the building facilities, the energy systems. I think, they go with an understanding that all this is done well, and we are just there inside, trying to deal with our core services. But the problem, starts, when they don't have the power system, running well, when they don't have the required, no objection certificate, from the fire department. That is when, they start thinking. But by the time, as Brian mentioned, they start thinking about this when they occupy the building and the entire system is actually functioning. So I think there are two major challenges here. I mean, one is on the reporting of the deaths, etc. I think there is a question around it. I mean, I'll not go into the details of that. I think that's subject to how a first information report is filed, and there is a kind of a judicial inquiry that goes into it. But as far as the building records are concerned, it's very hard to say how many buildings have a no objection certificate. I mean, may that be a residential building or a infrastructure like a hospital. And I think it's very important, I think, for facility owners to at least probably put a kind of a notice board outside, whether the building has the required compliance or not. Yeah, I'll just stop here. Over to you, Brian.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Brian, you want to
thanks.
complement?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think fire data is a global problem. Outside of a few countries, the US is particularly good at collecting data, but in many countries, the fire service doesn't collect good data. The police may not. In the case of India, they're collecting data, but in a lot of African countries, for example, if you have a national fire service that is so understaffed, collecting data is not something that's high on their list. So really, having resource to implement data collection, but also to be able to think about things like there have been people that have collected data through open reporting systems. So social media and others, you can scan through there to get a sense of what the issues are. Fundamental data on the numbers of buildings is important, but also the fire service capacity, how many stations per community, how many apparatus, and so forth. There's just a whole range of things, and the ISO document has some of those items in there, but countries don't have the means to implement them. So the real challenge is not saying what more do we need for data. It's what can countries actually get funding for in terms of collecting the data into various formats that have already been identified. I think there's a lot more that we can do through the internet and through satellite for a lot of data as well that we haven't really scratched the surface on. And I don't think that shows up in any of these ISO documents or others either.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Unfortunately, we're running over the time, so I will have to close, but I think this has been a very exciting discussion. I want to thank the speakers for sharing their experiences. I hope this have give light to some of our colleagues in the bank on the opportunities and the great challenges that our countries are facing and how we can improve our operations incorporating the fire safety. Thanks for the people joining outside the bank that also have shared some of the information and complementary sources and tools. And we look forward from the GFDRR perspective and from the Building Regulations Program to keep facilitating the dialogue in this topic. That's our role and that's what we are here for. So we look forward to hearing from our colleagues interested in promoting this topic and facilitating and providing the technical assistance that our clients need to improve the fire safety in moving forward. So thanks very much to everyone and looking forward to continue the conversation. Have a nice day and have a nice evening wherever you are. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.